have a fabulous speaker. You guys are going to get so much knowledge. This is our compliance director, Chris Woods, and he is so knowledgeable of what we're going to talk, because this is a huge component that now has been in place in the state of California, alongside with the NHD, that is part of our compliance package when you're doing a real estate transaction. So keep that in mind, please. If you have any questions, please ask us through in the chat. I would truly appreciate it. And yeah, so Chris, do you want to start now?
Yeah, sure. I can take it from here. Give me just a second here so I can get my screen shared, and we'll go from there. Awesome. And then per usual, Zoom moved everything around. So give me just a second here to get set up. Awesome. Alrighty. So today we're going to talk about the new home hardening disclosure and advisory that was put out by CAR. As you guys know, this CAR form is in response to the passage of Assembly Bill 38. And Assembly Bill 38 went through and charged CAL FIRE with a couple of things and added some new disclosure requirements for sellers in real estate transactions. And so we're just going to kind of walk you guys through how this situation unfolds, give you some information about the CAR form, give you some information about how Snap NHD is helping you guys out, pick up some of those extra pieces, and just some general information about what it is that we're talking about. So 3 things we're going over today, and we're going to stop after each one of these sections for some questions, some answers, and just to take a moment. First, we'll be talking about what is home hardening and what is defensible space. Then we're going to talk about the CAR form, and then we'll talk a bit about some pitfalls and what to watch out for on NHDs and with some of the other information that's going around. So those are our 3 sections. And like I said, we'll get to some questions and answers after each of those sections. It looks like we have a question and answer option here on this Zoom call. So go ahead and use that, or use the chat window. And I'll be happy to answer those questions as they come up, or as we get to the end of each one of those sections. So first, let's just start with some background. What is home hardening? What is defensible space? Kind of what does it entail, and what's the situation? In 2007, CAL FIRE was directed by the state to map various fire hazard severity zones across the state of California, as well as the zones where either a local agency was responsible for fire prevention, the state was responsible for fire prevention, or the federal government was responsible for fire prevention. So they created 2 separate maps, one talking about fire severity, one talking about who's responsible for those areas. And then along with those came some different disclosure requirements. Like many of you guys know, there's already 2 of those disclosures on the NHD, the very high fire hazard severity zone disclosure and the wildland area. Fast forward to the beginning of 2021, when properties are in high or very high fire hazard areas, the seller is going to be asked to disclose defensible space. And then in a couple months, now they're having to disclose like home hardening retrofits. And then in a few months, they're going to be having to disclose defensible space requirements starting in July. So what is home hardening? Home hardening consists of various building standards or retrofits that can be done to make a home a little bit less vulnerable to nearby wildfire. So even if the wildfire is not next to the home, it's entirely possible for that fire to throw embers that can land on the roof or land on a property. And if it's near another ignition source, it can then transfer into a larger fire from that ember that can then threaten the house itself. So CAL FIRE put together a list. This list can also be seen on this link, the readyforwildfire.org. It's a great website that CAL FIRE put together. It's got all kinds of information in there, and all of this information that I'm about to tell you can also be found on that website, and you can also give it out to your clients so they can read through it as well. But CAL FIRE was charged with putting together a list of some low-cost retrofits and some that are a bit more expensive to make homes less vulnerable to nearby wildfires. So one of the things they recommend as an example is covering roof vents, covering rain gutters with a metal mesh that has less than 1/8 of an inch in diameter for each of the openings. And the idea there is to keep embers from either working their way into the attic, working their way into the rain gutters where, debris might collect and dry out over summer, and just make that home just a little bit less vulnerable to those embers that are flying around. Another recommendation is replacing exterior building materials that are made out of wood with either a treated wood or a less combustible source. Like if you have a wood shingle roof, replacing it with something that's like composite or tile, replacing wood siding with something such as stucco, replacing a deck that's just made of wood with a composite material that's going to be less flammable, or even just like the eaves and the soffits on a home, and just making those made out of material other than wood, or treating that wood to make it a little less vulnerable to those wildfires. Another thing that CAL FIRE maintains is our defensible space requirements for homes that are in these high and very high fire hazard areas. These are a set of guidelines to help keep homes from catching on fire and to give firefighters space to defend homes. And so not only are these regulations going to keep fires from working themselves right up next to the home, but it's also going to give firefighters a place to defend the home from a nearby wildfire, because that's fires right up against the structure. Firefighters don't have anywhere to work. So the zones are broken up into two separate zones. The closest zone is the nearest 30 feet to the property, and then zone 2 is that 30 feet to 100 feet from the property, and they have different requirements according to CAL FIRE. In that nearest 30 feet, you're going to want to make sure that homes don't have any dead plants, dead grass, weeds, a collection of leaves, anything on the ground that's going to be good kindling or something that's going to be very easy to catch on fire. You want to make sure that there aren't any branches hanging over the roof, and especially not near the chimney, as the chimney is a possible ignition source to begin with. And, if a branch falls onto a roof, that can cause structural damage, but if that branch is on fire, that can also cause a structure fire. And then you also just want to keep space between, bushes and other bushes and trees, so that if one was to catch on fire, that fire isn't necessarily going to spread from one bush to a section of grass to another bush to a tree to the house. And so you're trying to limit the ability of that fire to spread. And so they recommend having that space between bushes and other bushes and shrubs and trees. The second zone is a little less restrictive. That area that is 30 feet from the home to 100 feet from the home. CAL FIRE recommends that you keep grass in that area under 4 inches tall. It's okay for things like fallen leaves, needles, twigs to collect in that area, so long as they don't reach or exceed a depth of 3 inches. Under that, I guess it doesn't pose as serious of a fire risk, but as that starts to grow, the amount of fuel that is there on the ground poses an extra risk to the property. Zone 2 is also the area where it is recommended that wood piles are stored. They don't want wood piles, at least they don't recommend wood piles be stored in that nearest 30 feet to the house. A wood pile is something you're using to start a fire anyway. Don't leave that fuel source right next to the house. Keep that at least 30 feet away from the house. And so just making these different, maintaining these regulations around a home is just going to make a home just that much less vulnerable to a wildfire, because the fuel's just not going to be there for a wildfire to get up next to the home. That is a general overview of home hardening retrofits and a general overview of defensible space. I know we went through that one a little bit quickly, but I want to get to kind of some of the meat of what we're going to talk about today. So we're just going to take a moment here, and if you guys have any questions, please throw those into the chat. If not, we'll move on, and any questions we can always come back to. All right, so really quick, I want to talk about the disclosure that we have in our NHD, because in a moment here, when we talk about the CAR form, you're going to see how they kind of work together. So this is our NHD disclosure on home hardening and defensible space. We just talked about the home hardening retrofits, and we talked about defensible space. One of the other things that we provide in our NHD is contact information for the nearest CAL FIRE unit. A little bit later, we're going to be talking about CAL FIRE inspection reports that can be included in the transaction. And this is the contact information that you want to pass on to your sellers or to work with yourself, so you guys can get in contact with CAL FIRE and schedule those inspections. We provide that information right here in our NHD so that you guys can have that information at your fingertips and don't need to go searching for it. But then the most important part of this disclosure here is this last line, because this line is going to tell you whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity area. And we'll see here in a minute with the CAR form that that's the determination that's going to tell you whether or not a property is in a high or very high fire hazard area and be one of the criteria triggering those additional disclosures. So bottom line of that disclosure, as well as a couple other places in the NHD, we'll take a look at those later. But it'll give you that clear determination on whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity area. While we're on that note, talking about criteria for when these disclosures are going to be applicable, let's take a look at the CAR form. So the CAR form has a bunch of great information packed into it. It's a very quick and easy read. It's a one-page disclosure and advisory, so it's very short. And they break it down for you so that you can kind of remember, when is this applicable? What is it talking about? But let's go through a couple of the other details in here. First section here is talking about the law applicability. And we're going to walk through each of these different criteria for when sellers are required to include these additional disclosures. So let's see what we got here. The disclosures specified in section 2 are only required if the sellers of residential properties of 1 to 4 units. This is our first criteria for determining whether or not a seller of property is going to possibly have these additional disclosure requirements. So it only applies to residential property. So if you're selling commercial property, if you're selling a large apartment complex of more than 4 units, or if you're selling vacant land, these disclosures don't necessarily apply. You might want to include the information anyway, but this is only a requirement for residential properties of 1 to 4 units. Going forward, it also says that that structure has to be constructed before January 1st, 2010. January 1st, 2010 is significant because on that date, the new Wildland Urban Interface building codes went into effect for the state of California. And those building codes already make the home hardening retrofits that would be recommended by CAL FIRE. Those are now a standard part of the building code. So there's nothing more to disclose per this statute to a buyer. Because if the home's built after 2010, they're already using fire resistant siding. They're already going to have all the vent covers and everything. It's just a standard part of the building code. So for that property to have a permitted structure, it's already going to have all those retrofits in place, and the disclosure is not really going to be necessary. So residential properties of 1 to 4 units constructed before January 1st, 2010 that are located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. This is what I was just talking about a minute ago with our report. Remember, on our NHD, we have the disclosure that says this property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity area. I know this particular part of the disclosure might be a little bit out of the norm for most real estate agents, but determining whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone is second nature to us at Snap NHD. We already disclose hazards across the board, as well as a number of fire hazards. And so for us, we already had the information, we already had the data in-house. For us, it just took a little bit of recalibrating to make all of that data work for this particular disclosure. So when taking a look at this information, take a look at our NHD reports, which you guys can get early in the transaction, and determine whether or not that property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone, so you can know whether or not this property might have additional disclosure requirements with the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. And then the last criteria is whether or not the property requires a real estate transfer disclosure statement. So your probates, your REO sales, sales of that nature, they're not going to require this additional seller disclosure. But in most traditional sales where the seller owns the property and is normally going to complete a TDS, this disclosure can apply. So you have to meet all 4 criteria. going through those again just to recap. Residential property of 1 to 4 units, constructed before January 1st, 2010, in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and is the seller's required to complete a TDS. So if you meet all 4 of those requirements, the seller will have some additional disclosure requirements. And we'll get into what those disclosure requirements are here in a minute when we get down to the second section of this form. But we're going to walk through a couple other sections here in the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory first. This second section here is just a recommendation from the California Association of Realtors to rely on an NHD company. California Association of Realtors reached out to us many months ago when we were just figuring out what was going on with AB 38, right after it was passed, to determine how can NHD companies help, buyers, sellers, real estate agents determine whether or not there are going to be additional disclosure requirements. We volunteered and we're working with CAR on creating the disclosure so that we can take the responsibility of determining whether or not a property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, so that you guys don't have to do that work. It's already going to be in our NHD. As CAR recommends, rely on our NHD and we'll help you guys out in that particular determination. As many of you guys know, in CAR forms, there are blanket determinations that are made, and then they give you check boxes or some fill in the blank sections so you guys can modify the information that are in these template forms. They do the same thing here in this particular section of CAR form HHDA. So if you want to disclose these home hardening retrofits in the disclosure and advisory, but the property is not in a high or a very high fire hazard area, this is a section where you can do that. This section states whether or not, or is stating that the property is in a high or very high fire hazard area unless you check the is not box. It is entirely possible for a property to be in a moderate fire hazard area. It is incredibly common throughout California when you start getting into the areas where the state's responsible for fire prevention. And it might still be advisable. Your broker might want you to use these extra disclosures in those areas on top of when it would already be in a high or a very high fire hazard area. So you can check this box so you're not contradicting information that's being found elsewhere in the transaction. And this last section here is just a brief overview of some other situations in which CAR recommends you might want to use this additional disclosure and advisory to protect the seller, just to give the information to the buyer. It might not be applicable by law, it might minimally applicable, might not be a requirement, but there are some other situations where if you're near mountainous areas, forest covered lands, the properties nearby have a lot of brush or just, kind of wild and unkept, you might want to include the disclosure anyway. And this would kind of play into when you'd also want to use this box to check that the property is not in a high or very high fire hazard area, but you want to use the disclosure anyway. So that is all just talking about using the form, when to use it, how to use it, where to get some information. The second section here is talking about the actual disclosure. This is the actual disclosure from the seller to the buyer. AB 38 has a blanket paragraph including information from CAL FIRE included in the code itself, and is included in the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory by CAR so that it satisfies that disclosure requirement. This is just a blanket notice saying, this home's located in a high or very high fire hazard severity area, built before January 1st, 2010, and you might want to consider some improvements if you have concerns about how vulnerable the home may be to a wildfire, and then provides the link to the CAL FIRE website so they can go do some of their own research. The second part of the second section here is the part we're going to want to pay the most attention to. This is the section where the seller is actually going to make a disclosure regarding the condition of the home. The first thing, though, we want to clue in on is the seller is aware of the following features. So this is not an investigative report. This is similar to many of the other disclosures like in the TDS and the SPQ, where the seller doesn't need to go through the home and test everything to determine what the condition is of every little part of the home. This is only the stuff in which the seller is aware. So These are also the fire hardening retrofits that we were talking about earlier. The seller just has to check the box for the ones that they are aware of. If there's eaves, soffits, roof ventilation that don't have mesh coverings, they don't have to climb onto the roof and look at them. But if they know that they're open, they can check that box so they can give that information to the seller. If they know that the roof is made of untreated wood shingles or shakes, they can check the box. If they know that the property has single pane or non-tempered glass windows, they can check that box, and they can go through and they can just make these disclosures to the buyer of which they're aware. It's real simple. Check boxes. You guys can help your sellers with that, help them through it, and facilitate that form for them. This third section here is talking about final inspection reports. CAL FIRE calls these something a little bit different. They call them defensible space inspections. But essentially what happens is you can have a CAL FIRE inspector come out to the property and take a look at this property in relation to wildfire regulations. So they'll take a look at the defensible space characteristics of the property, whether or not they're in compliance with the defensible space regulations, as well as taking a look at, some of the vulnerabilities of the home from a home hardening retrofit standpoint. CAR included this information so that it can be brought into the transaction in a written format so that the buyers can be informed about where they can find the transaction, and the sellers have it in writing that they gave this information to the buyers. Because it's always a great idea whenever you're doing a real estate transaction to bring in other experts when applicable. Like you're always going to bring in a home inspector to do a home inspection. You can always rely on CAL FIRE as an expert to come in and give a report on the defensible space and the home hardening retrofit characteristics of the home. So that the seller doesn't have to carry all of that responsibility, you can rely on the expertise of CAL FIRE in this situation. A note on these inspections, however, is the line to get these inspections can be relatively long. It can take time for for inspectors to get out to the property, and the inspectors are seasonal, so they're only around for 6 months out of the year, generally around April to October. So even outside of those months, it could take even longer for a CAL FIRE inspector to get out to the property and do an inspection. This might change as, the year goes on and as more of these disclosures or these inspection reports are being requested of CAL FIRE, they might start retaining more inspectors. But from the time being, these inspectors are seasonal and it might take some time before the inspectors can get out to the property. So with that being said, this is where you kind of want to get your NHD really early in your transaction or even on your way to a listing presentation. With Snap NHD, you can get your NHD on before you go to a listing presentation so that you have that information to review before you even go to the listing presentation. There is no risk involved. We are not going to charge you for the NHD if it's not going to be used. If you don't get the listing, you can just cancel the report or just ignore the report, and we're not going to charge you for it or harass you about it. If you do get into a transaction and the buyer's agents are insisting on using another NHD company, it's totally fine. We're not going to charge you for it. We want you guys to have this information as early in the transaction as possible so that you guys can be as prepared as you can be when you guys get into escrow. So when you're going to a listing presentation, get your NHD ordered from Snap NHD early, contact Wendy about it. There's no risk. There's no reason not to. We'll get you that information so that you know early and ahead of time what hazards might be roadblocks or something that can trip up a transaction once it gets into escrow. You can take care of it when you're going to sign a listing agreement. Specifically, when it comes to this final inspection report, that would be a fantastic time to talk to your then sellers about calling CAL FIRE and getting that inspection scheduled because it could take some time. So you want to get that done as early as possible, because if you're waiting to try to get that inspection done and you're ordering it at the beginning of a 30-day escrow, it's incredibly unlikely that CAL FIRE is going to make it out there to be able to handle that inspection report. So contact Wendy, get your Snap NHD reports early, get them quickly, and there's no risk to you guys regarding that. So there's really no reason not to. We're going to take another short break right here. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those right now. Feel free to post those in the question and answer section or in the chat box. And then we're going to talk about some pitfalls with some of the other fire hazard data that's out there regarding the NHD and these particular disclosures.
I don't see anything in the chat right now or in the Q&A portion.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about a couple pitfalls. We're going to get kind of technical here, but it'll make sense as we kind of work our way through it. So let's take a look at the NHD report. So this is the Natural Hazard Disclosure Statement. And in here, there are already 2 questions regarding fire that are included in the NHD. Oh, hang on. We got a question from the last section. Is there a cost to the seller for the inspection? As of right now, I don't believe that there is. When I was talking with CAL FIRE early last month, they were saying that those defensible space inspections do not have a cost associated with them, but they may going forward as those inspection requests increase. I have a feeling that as we're going forward with this, real estate transactions are going to start requesting many, many more of these final inspection reports from CAL FIRE. And so I have a feeling that some of that regulation is going to change over time. So we'll keep you guys up to date on how that works, but we have that CAL FIRE contact information in the disclosure down here at the bottom. You can always call them ahead of time and ask and see if the status has changed. But yeah, as of right now, there is not a charge for most of those defensible space inspections according to CAL FIRE. All right, so natural hazard disclosure statement. This is the typical natural hazard disclosure statement that is outlined in the civil code. It has 2 separate disclosures that are regarding fire, and they kind of play into each other. And so we're going to go through that a little bit and how these are both not great indicators for determining whether or not a property has these additional seller disclosures. Both of them can help toward that determination, but it is going to take a little bit more in-depth research to determine whether or not that property specifically has those disclosure requirements, which is why we have that other disclosure report or disclosure in our NHD. And I'll show you a couple of those spots afterwards of where you can see that information in our report. The first one, and we're going to skip over this one and come back to it here in a second, is the very high fire hazard severity zone. And then you also have a disclosure regarding wildland areas. Wildland areas a wildland area is a term that is given to an area in which CAL FIRE or the state fire agency is responsible for fire suppression and prevention activities. So anywhere where CAL FIRE is going to operate, it's their responsibility to do these fire suppression and prevention activities. And they also have that area also has most of the high and very high fire hazard severity zones in the state. This disclosure will be marked yes. So this is not a good disclosure because there is also a moderate fire hazard severity area that is in this wildland area. And so it's broken down into 3 separate hazard classes. So just because this box is marked yes, does not mean necessarily that this property has those additional seller disclosure requirements. However, if this box is marked yes and you do want to include the CAR form HHDA, you are entirely welcome to. If you have questions on that, you're always welcome to reach out to us and we can work through some of the intricacies of it, because if you are in fact in that moderate severity zone in the wildland area, you're just going to want to make sure that you check the box on the CAR form HHDA that the property is not in a high or very high fire hazard area. So this disclosure is really only talking about who is responsible for fire prevention activities. It doesn't specifically talk about the hazard class for the property. The other disclosure about fire that we're going to come back to now is the very high fire hazard severity zone. First off, this is only determining whether or not a property is in a very high fire hazard severity area. It doesn't include high. So if this is marked no, it's entirely possible the property could be in a high fire hazard severity area, but this property would then still be marked no. The other portion of this, and this is the part that gets most confusing, is that if a property is located in a very high fire hazard severity zone. However, it is also located in a wildland area where the state is responsible for fire prevention and suppression activities. This very high fire hazard severity zone has to be marked no. The definition of a very high fire hazard severity zone, according to Government Code Section 51177, don't worry, that's not on the test, but it is the section immediately preceding the government code that calls for this disclosure, defines a very high fire hazard severity zone as being an area designated by the director to be a very high fire hazard severity zone that is not in a state responsibility area. So it is not possible for on an NHD for a property to be marked yes in the wildland area and also be marked yes for the very high fire hazard severity zone. I'm not a huge fan of this particular definition. I know many in the industry aren't either. A lot of us are working to try to get this changed, but for the time being, that's the situation that we're in, that it is entirely possible for a property to be in a very high fire hazard severity zone, but by law, we have to mark this particular disclosure as no. So as you can see, both of these determinations are not great for determining whether or not a property has additional seller disclosures. So where to look if the property has those additional disclosures, at least as far as the fire severity zones are concerned. On the second page of the Snap NHD report, we have our report snapshot. This is the first section where you will see a good definitive determination on whether or not the property has these additional disclosure requirements, because this is a general overview, a brief summarized overview of all of the information that is contained in the NHD. And so the two big sections down here at the bottom where we specifically call out two separate sections in the NHD to give them a little extra exposure is the special flood hazard area, obviously because that comes with an additional building requirements and or possibly including flood insurance, as well as this property is or is not located in a high or very high fire hazard severity area. This determination will always be here on the snapshot page. And so you can always take a look right here and get that first look at whether or not the property may have those additional seller disclosure requirements. The second place that you can look is on our table of contents. This is like a more detailed summary of the NHD. Not only is it telling you where you can go in the report for more information, but we also include the in and out determinations for all of the disclosures. And so right here, you'll also see an in or an out determination made for the home hardening and defensible space disclosure, which, like we just saw in the snapshot, is determining whether or not a property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity area. And then, of course, the third place in the report is the actual disclosure itself. This is what we were looking at a few minutes ago with the disclosure in our NHD. This particular sample property is not located in a high or very high fire hazard area, but this is also a good place where you can look for that determination, as well as find a lot of the information that we've covered today in the report. So you want to take a look into those few spots. Those are going to be the best places to look because those first two disclosures, they predate AB 38 by about 2 decades. And so they're just not specifically created to determine whether or not a property has those additional disclosure requirements. So specifically look at the determinations in the NHD that are made specifically for the home hardening and defensible space disclosure. I'd like to take this opportunity now to answer any questions that you guys might have. I'll throw out a couple other tidbits as we go forward. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I know we covered a lot of information here today. It's very detailed, but last thing I want to reiterate is you guys can always reach out to us at Snap NHD for questions on this information. You can always reach out to Wendy. You can always reach out to our main customer service line, and they always know how to get a hold of me, and I can always be there to answer your questions. I'm more than happy to go through and look at some of those weird properties because we all know that there are weird situations where not every house has the same characteristics and can be easily determined whether it's in or out of this, that, or whatever else. So if you have a weird situation with home hardening and defensible space and the disclosure requirements for that, if you've got a weird question for flood, earthquakes, anything like that, you guys can always reach out to us and we can help you through that process. I think Wendy even posted her contact information in the chat. So if you have a second, you can go into the chat box and grab Wendy's contact information. She is wendy@snapnhd.com and can also be reached by phone at 310-480-7510. So we'll take a few minutes. We'll open it up for questions. Please let me know. Please feel free to ask any questions you guys may have.
We don't have any questions in the chat or Q&A, but I do want to reiterate that I did put my information in there because the NHD report, you have to understand that they're very catered to that one subject property. So if your property does fall in any of this, please feel free to give us a call and we'll go over them based on the report that you just received. Did you stop sharing?
Yeah, I did. I stopped sharing just so everybody could see, your pretty face and listen to your message, focus on you.
Thank you. You're so kind.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we don't have any questions right now from anybody. So if you would like to proceed to the end of the presentation, that'd be great.
Sounds good. Well, thank you everybody for coming here today. I know we threw a lot of information at you. We at Snap NHD are always here for you guys on all of your natural hazard disclosure needs or any of your disclosure needs. Feel free to give us a call with any questions. One thing that I do want to talk about here is one of the new features that we have coming here in the next week or so. Sorry, no worries. One of the new features that we have coming in about the next week or so, soon we will be releasing an integration with the California Association of Realtors to include their specific form, the Home Hardening and Defensible Space Agreement. We'll be including that form in the NHD report. When it meets certain criteria, we can set this up on a brokerage level or specific to an agent so that any report that you order, if it falls in either a high or a very high fire hazard severity area, we can include the home hardening disclosure and advisory for you guys. If for some reason, if you want to include them in all of the state responsibility areas, which would include high and very high fire hazard areas, as well as that moderate fire hazard area, we can include them in that as well. We can tailor all of that to you guys. So feel free to reach out to Wendy and talk with her about that. That is a feature we'll have coming up here shortly, just to help you guys out and help get that document into the transaction when it's going to be needed or might be needed. So that's really all that we have today. Looks like no last minute questions have popped up. So thank you so much for coming to our webinar today. We hope you guys got some great information. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Wendy is always available to you guys, and we'll see you guys soon.
Yes, thank you all for attending. Appreciate it so much.
Yes, we appreciate you guys. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Chris. I'll be reaching out to you guys soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful week.